One of the questions I wanted to ask you about, Dennis, was the way that you used real people in your book. Of course, there was Babe Ruth, but also Calvin Coolidge, who amazingly went on to be the 30th president of the United States.
Yes.
30th. 30th president of the United States. So, what did you start with? Did you start with? I mean, you sort of touched on this in your last answer, but did you start with the people that you wanted to write about, and then meld your story around them, or did you start with the story and then the characters came and sort of knocked on your door and said, "Here I am"?
I started with the event. I started with the event, which was the Boston police strike, and then I just started tracking back, and ended up realizing that ultimately that I fell in love with a 12-month period of history. That first I wanted to write about the Boston police, and then I said give it context. So back up, just back up to the Red Summer. So backed up to the Red Summer, which was if you were white America, Red Summer meant when Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, went after communists, communist hunting. If you were Black American, it was called Red Summer, ironically, because it was a year of prodigious race riots and race massacres. So the streets ran red with our blood. So I went there. And then I was like, well, you can't really start with a Red Summer. Back up just a little more, give them context. Why were people afraid of radicals? Why were people afraid of communists? Why were there so many race riots? Why, so backed up a little bit further. Then I was like, okay, this is pretty good, but there was this amazing molasses flood that happened in Boston, and it's only a couple of months behind me. So I backed up a little bit further. I got to the molasses flood, and I said, well, I'm at the molasses flood. You can't friggin' start a book with a molasses flood. You got to give it context. Well, we'll start with the flu. So then I backed up to the flu, and then I was like, you can't just come in on pestilence. So that was sort of how I got swept up in that. And then with the Boston police strike, what I knew was I would have to deal with real people. Yeah. Because Calvin Coolidge, what amazed me about the Boston police strike was that I say now, Calvin Coolidge was the greatest case of failing upwards into the Oval Office until 2000. He did nothing right. He was completely incompetent during the police strike, but he did an amazingly modern thing. He stepped in front of the microphones with a perfect line, and it changed his life. It changed America. He said nobody has the right to strike against the public interest anytime or anywhere. Bang, and it went national. And he became a national hero. This is a guy who did not a single thing right during the Boston police strike. So he was in there, and then all of a sudden it was like, I got him in there, I got Ruth in there, I'm going to have to get this guy James Sturrow in there, I have to get the mayor in there, because the mayor was just fascinating. And then I said, well, since I'm already dealing with it, wonder what Hoover was up to then. And then I had this really cool moment. This is when I felt the most free, and this is when I felt the book broke wide for me. I was writing at that point. I was living in Boston, and I love to write outdoors, so I always rent places with decks. So I was in Kenmore Square in Boston, and off to, if I looked that way, I could see Fenway Park. If I looked that way, I could see the building where my father had worked for 35 years, which meant a lot to me. And then if I looked this way, I could see the hotel where Eugene O'Neill died, and which is now a dorm for Boston University. And one day I was just sitting there, and I went, Fenway Park, Eugene O'Neill. Wouldn't it be great if Babe Ruth punched Eugene O'Neill in the face? Yeah, that would be really cool. I don't know if it happened, but they were in Boston at the same time, so I'm going to write a fight scene in which Babe Ruth punches Eugene O'Neill. Why? I have nothing against Eugene O'Neill. I love Eugene O'Neill. I just thought there's something there, and that blew the book wide open for me. It was when I wrote that chapter that I went, now I know what I'm doing. I'm paying homage to a certain time, but I'm also saying this was a rollicking time. This was for all the pestilence, for all the violence. I think what comes through in this book is really what, you don't need, this isn't blowing anything. The last line of the book is, what a time to be alive. And that was my feeling every single second when I was writing it was, wow, this is just crazy, so. Yeah.
And actually, just to stay with that for a second, it was something that you and I were talking about on Sunday. In fact, was the resonances between America now in this terrible, the times of political upheaval we have, and America then. In particular, I'm thinking of how after the First World War. in those times of uncertainty, people had to find someone to blame. And in those days, of course, it was the Italians. And now, of course, that all sounds really familiar because we're doing exactly the same thing. Did you, again, was that intentional?
It wasn't intentional, but at first. But as I began to go and investigate the time period, it occurred to me that very quickly that an untrained chimpanzee could see the parallels, right. And so my job was, from that point, to step back, not step forward, because it was ridiculous. I mean, we had the Patriot Act of our time was called the Espionage and Sedition Act of 1917. The Mitchell Palmer was the John Ashcroft of his time. Our Al Qaeda was the Galleonist anarchist movement. It just got absolutely crazy. And so I just said, lay it out there and just let it go. And also, the biggest mistake you can make is, I think, as a writer, as a novelist, is to write a political novel. That's the difference between a political novel and a social novel. A political novel, to me, is I know where I stand. And so I'm going to write a novel that's just basically setting up the neocons as a paper tiger. Well, that's not terribly interesting. And so while I'm a pro-union guy because I came from a union family, at the same time, the question of the novel is, should our emergency personnel be allowed to strike? I think it's a very valid question. It's the question of, I believe in free speech, but I don't think you should be allowed to yell fire in a theater. I believe in striking, but at the same time, I don't know if I should think the firemen should be allowed to walk off the job. So.
Right. Okay. Well, the other big parallel for me in the books, of course, and it's a very obvious one, and that's Boston. Both of you have almost all your books are set in Boston. Mm-hmm. So, so I was going to turn to you next, Tess, and say, why do you think this is?
I live in the state of Maine, which is I live in a town about 4 hours of driving north of Boston, and the state of Maine has the lowest homicide rate of just about any state in the country. And here I was going to be writing a crime novel that had a serial killer, and it had a homicide detective, and it had blah, blah, blah. And I realized I could not do a series in Maine, otherwise it would succumb to the Jessica Fletcher effect, which is a small town in Maine where everybody ends up getting murdered. That's just not the reality of Maine. I wanted to have a city where it would seem really realistic. So I set it in the nearest metropolitan area, which was Boston. And what I do pretty much is drive down there when I need to do my research. And I'm through Boston quite often, but I make no claims to being nearly as familiar with it or to feel that it runs in my blood the way Dennis's does.
So over to you, Dennis. You grew up there.
Yeah, I did. I just want to say thank you for doing that. There's just one writer, I can't say who it is, but there's just one writer who has a small town in her books, and every month there's a serial killer, and it's a small town. So I started thinking after about the 7th book, who's left? I mean, if you kill 20 people a book and you're in a small town, 140 people, you've wiped out the town. So yeah, it's weird. One of the reasons I stopped my series was what I called the heart-to-heart syndrome. I don't know if you remember that TV show, but it was every time they would go somewhere, somebody would die. And they were always going somewhere. They were always traveling somewhere. And I just couldn't believe after a certain point that anybody would invite them anywhere. That they'd, and so I just started thinking, Robert Wagner's like the kiss of death, man. Anybody sees him coming. So I felt that way about my series. After a certain point, I said, I can't have them keep getting into these adventures, or they'll end up, with that novel where they're on the cruise ship and the chef gets killed. They're the only ones who can solve it. So yeah, that's my little aside on that whole issue. Boston is just like, it's in my blood. It's the water in my well, and when the water runs out, then I'll go someplace else and I'll write a book set in Arkansas. But until then, why, if the water's still in my well, why should I go to somebody else's well? Just doesn't seem, it continues to feed me.
Right,
so,
right.